Processed foods are killing us. Everybody knows that. Ding, 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 ding. Oops, pardon me. That's my alarm bell that goes off every time I think everybody knows that. I remember when everybody knew that women were bad drivers and girls couldn't do math. And to this very day, I can walk into certain gyms where everybody knows you need animal protein and lots of it. So whenever I hear everybody knows something, I think, maybe there's something we don't know. Could there be another side to the story on processed foods? Well, let's be courageous to hear something maybe we're not up for hearing. But come on, we're strong and brave and truth warriors, right? Yeah, right. Hi, everybody. I am Victoria Moran, host of the Main Street Vegan podcast, and so happy to have you with me today, where we are going to be entering an area of controversy. And oh my gosh, who thought that? And where does this come from? Well, I think by the end of this hour, you are going to be absolutely broadened in your mental space by what we are about to learn. My guests today are authors of a very exciting new book, Feed the People: Why Industrial Food is Good and How to Make It Even Better. Jan Dutkiewicz is an assistant professor at the Pratt Institute. He is a contributing writer at Vox and a contributing editor at the New Republic. He lives in Brooklyn. And Gabriel N. Rosenberg, PhD, is an associate professor at Duke University and a science research scholar at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. He lives in Durham, North Carolina. Welcome, gentlemen. And what made you want to write a book that people would have to have so many caveats about? Either one of you, jump in.
Well, I don't know that we have to have so many caveats, but
Okay.
we did, I think, enter into a space of being willing to take on a lot of conventional wisdom. And our interest was, I think, in challenging in particular a lot of the conventional wisdom that specifically food writing and food journalism has tended to circulate in the last 3 to 4 decades through the so-called farm to fork or locavore movements. And we generally found that although there are sort of like aesthetic sensibilities around those movements that we might want to be able to defend, that on the balance, thinking about them as social movements with political objectives, that they really hadn't improved the food system for as many people and as we like to think as well for animals, that in fact they were not capable of delivering on the promises of food justice that they had set out to deliver. And so, from that perspective, we kind of wanted to ask the question of like, what's gone wrong with food writing for the last 30 years, and if we correct ourselves on that, what does a better movement look like? What are its objectives? What are its guiding principles? And who's going to be better served by it? And so, our book, in kind of dispensing with that conventional wisdom, um, really sets out an agenda that's looking to improve the food system, not only for eaters, and so for many of your listeners, but also for workers, for the environment broadly, and for the animals, of course, that are a big part of it, which I know is going to be something that's quite important to your listeners as well.
It is indeed. And everybody, if you're listening on an Audible platform, then that was Dr. Rosenberg. So just get to know the voices and you'll
Can,
know who's talking if you're on YouTube.
can I
Yes.
can I make a minor point about my introduction there?
Yes,
Is that,
please.
that at some point Zoom put me as Dr. Gabriel Rosenberg, PhD, which is,
Yeah.
I just want to say that I do not normally introduce myself as Dr. PhD, which is both redundant and is a bit much. And I just also want to note that Jan is also a doctor, and that I am not the only doctor PhD on the call. So that's
Okay.
my only point.
Well, everything just got upped. You are the authors of what I personally, if I were a betting person, would say is going to be a New York Times bestseller, and you're both PhDs. So there we go. So thank you so much for that introduction to this very interesting topic. So Jan, I'm going to go with first names now, then I don't have to do doctors. What is industrial food? What are we exactly talking about?
When we're talking about industrial food, we're talking about food that basically meets three criteria. It's produced at scale, and it's produced at scale to maximize the efficiency of production and also to achieve affordability. We're talking about food that's produced to set standards, and we're talking about food that's regulated, which is to say there are regulations about everything from how food is produced and what conditions, how workers are treated, and otherwise there's a system of laws and policies that govern food production. So basically, we're talking about almost everything in our current food system. Our food system is industrial. And that's, in a sense, the first thing we want to communicate to readers. I think people have a tendency to conflate industrial with bad or industrial with processed. And I know we're going to unpack that later, but the point is there are these sort of associations. But that's not the case. I mean, whether you're eating Fruit Loops at the supermarket or you're buying your ingredients in the grocery aisle of your, in the produce aisle of your grocery store, they're all coming from the industrial food system. And I think this is often overlooked. And so what we're trying to do in the book is number one, show people that most food they eat is industrial and that this is not bad. But then say, look, there are really major problems with our food system and that we need to fix them. But that in order to fix them, we can't turn our back on economies of scale production or the regulatory state or technology. We just need to lean in to the best parts of that food system to improve the quality and affordability of the average diet for the average eater in the United States.
So I think that some of my listeners who like to put on a detective hat, as in the current climate, we all need detective hats socked away somewhere, is what is your personal interest in this? I think some people are thinking, are they working for big ag? So tell me who you work for and where your interest started with all of this.
So, no, I certainly don't take any money from Big Ag. I'm paid exclusively by Duke University and by during the summer months sometimes the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, um, and those are my only sources of funding. So we can start off with that. I know that our recent New York Times op-ed raised a lot of unhinged speculation that we were on the payroll or something like this. So no, I think that in both cases it grows out of um, both very sort of earnest political sentiments and then uh, really deep study. I've been working on and writing about agricultural history and the history of the food system for at this point more than 2 decades. I'm a longstanding critic of agrarianism and the role that I would describe, what I would describe as nostalgic agrarianism plays in distorting our understandings of the food system, and in many cases also distorting our ability to modify it in favorable ways. And that's been something that's been true long before we ever set about to sort of like write this book. That's been a major intellectual and sort of political interest. Um, I I think that like I really suddenly wanted to write for the public on an issue like this. It's actually tied to a moment that we write about in the book in 2012 when the Obama White House attempted to revise Department of Labor standards that would have brought agriculture into compliance on the issue of child labor with every other sector of the American economy. A lot of people don't know there's a lot of child labor in agriculture. Much of it is legal. Much of the legal child labor actually masks illegal child labor. But there are large exemptions for farms to be able to access that labor. And so the Department of Labor tried to revise the rules in 2012. Um, they got shot down because it was an election year, and a lot of farm state Democrats were very uncomfortable, particularly because the rule changes were demonized as targeting small farmers and attempting to make farm chores illegal, which was a complete misstatement and totally inaccurate. I was a lot younger at that point and didn't have a record of writing for the public, but I sought to write an op-ed about it because I had written a lot about child labor in the history of agriculture as a result of some of my earlier research. And I found that nobody wanted to listen. And not only that, I eventually did publish something in like the Raleigh Durham newspaper here, the News Observer. But I found that all of the most cherished, supposedly left-leaning progressive voices of the American food movement, and that would be your Michael Pollins, that would be your Alice Waters, people who were supposed to be representing the issue of food justice were totally silent on the issue. And I don't know if it's because they were denied a podium to speak on it or because they didn't want to talk about it. Um, but it seemed to me that something was wrong, that if the sort of invocation of this agrarian happy farm nonsense could like turn us off from the fundamental task of like helping the most vulnerable people in our society, then who else were we not serving when we went along with that kind of orthodoxy? And it turns out that it's not just the children that we're not serving. We're also not serving workers more broadly. We're not serving eaters. And in the broadest sense, we're also not serving animals in the environment. And all of those things are left out of the equation. And so that to me was a radicalizing moment. That was a moment when I wanted to really dive into the debate. And it was another 10 to 15 years before it came together, thankfully, because of the writing that we've done together. That was a long answer, and that's me personally. I think Jan is going to have a different answer and one that may be more specifically to the topic of this podcast, because he is a longstanding vegan whose research interests also, of course, intersect with that issue.
Excellent. So, Jan, let's hear that from you. And also, if you can throw in how the two of you found one another.
Sure. So I've been also studying the American food system for, over a decade. I'm actually, I think, a relatively outspoken critic of large-scale agribusiness in the United States, rather than someone aligned with it. But I'm coming at all of this as a political economist. I'm very concerned with the intersection between how we organize agricultural production and agricultural value chains and their impact on the environment and on public health. And then, of course, I'm also very interested in the ethics of eating and the ethics of diet more broadly. And in a sense, what I found throughout my research and what led me to public writing and eventually to this book was that on the one hand, you had this quite robust research in everything from public health to environment to food security that points pretty squarely in the direction of a few large-scale food system solutions, which is number one, eat less meat, eat less dairy, eat more plants. Number two, if you're going to address things like food security, you got to think at really large scale. And number three, if you're going to address public health issues or labor issues, you have to think of large scale regulation within the existing food system. So I was sitting here among all this academic literature, and then I was looking at mainstream food writing, which points towards other things. It points towards, small farms and farmers markets, maybe even turning your back on the regulatory state, suggesting the regulatory state is somehow corrupt. And the two just didn't square. And so I was driven to writing, sort of doing public facing writing in a sense to translate the academic literature for the public. And then Gabriel and I met at a conference that he organized at Yale back when he was a postdoc, I was a PhD student, but we started writing together, I think in the early days of the COVID pandemic. We just we were just talking to each other and we found that there were quite a few things sort of in that early pandemic food discourse, everything around between the emerge sort of like the explosion of alt protein and questions of zoonotic disease that were happening. And so we just started writing together and from there grew, I think, a really fruitful relationship. We write really well together. We bring completely different areas of expertise to the table. And and yeah, and then from there the opportunity came to write this book, which we jumped on, and that's been our life for the last few years.
Oh, well, it's an excellent and important thing to be doing with your life. So, in the present moment, we're hearing a lot about ultra processed foods. We also have some people in the current administration who are talking a lot about food and food safety, but coming out with recommendations that are very disheartening to vegan, like myself and many of those listening and speaking here today. So, can you help us unpack just where we are at the present moment?
You want me to do that, Gabe?
Yeah, why don't you
I
take
mean,
this one?
I mean, I
So
think
you're
maybe you can cover the second part of the question, which is the sort of broader political context. But I mean,
yeah.
since you already introduced us talking about ultra processing, let's get the ultra processing and food processing question out of the way first. So this term, ultra processing, has really jumped into the food discourse zeitgeist over the last few years. It's replaced terms we used to use like junk food. And it's what it basically suggests is that foods that are processed, specifically industrially processed, so foods that are cooked using ingredients that you wouldn't find in your own kitchen, it's probably the easiest shorthand that people use, are somehow bad for your health or nutritionally inferior. All of this comes from a really bad mistranslation of a proposed epidemiological schema that comes out of Brazil called NOVA. I'm going to try to keep this answer short, but this is really important for people to understand where this all comes from. So, a number of public health scholars in Brazil in the late 2000s basically wanted to understand the link between diet quality and health outcomes at the population level in different parts of Brazil. And they wanted to schematize this as simply as possible. And so, what they found is that people who were eating a lot of sort of mass produced relatively foods that are relatively poor in nutritional quality were having worse health outcomes. And so they've developed this new schema for thinking about foods called NOVA. So most people actually use it as an acronym or assume that it's an acronym and they capitalize it, but it's not. It's just the Portuguese word for new. It just means new classification, and it divides foods into four categories. So unprocessed foods, so an apple. Number two, sort of household culinary ingredients. So things like, for instance, oil, salt. Three, foods that you can cook at home by combining ingredients from the other groups. So pasta, for instance, right? Pasta with tomato sauce. And then ultra processed, which is this massive catch-all category, which is just all food that is produced using either extraction of individual ingredients, so sort of like pea protein isolate, soy protein isolate, or that has preservatives you wouldn't use in your kitchen, so be it xanthan gum, potassium sorbate, or what have you. And this entire category is what's treated as ultra processed, which, if you're looking top down at the population level across all kinds of different foods, it might be a sort of easy shorthand. But what it's really flawed is what it actually does is it creates this massive category, this catch-all category that basically treats Fruit Loops and Oreos and Oatly oat milk and Impossible burgers and baby formula all as equally bad, which is absurd because what this does is it completely ignores both the specifics of how specific foods are processed, what processes they undergo to become foods that are sold to the public. And number two, it completely overlooks the nutritional properties of individual foods. And so it's kind of this potato masher that creates this completely unwieldy category. But now that that's entered the zeitgeist, people just assume everything that's quote unquote ultra processed is somehow nutritionally inferior or unhealthy. And the problem with that is that it's absolutely untrue. In fact, we've got reams of peer-reviewed research that suggests that that's not the case. What matters the most is what is processed and not how it is processed. So what that means is, yeah, an Oreo is bad for you, but it's not bad for you because it's ultra processed. It's bad for you because each single Oreo contains the equivalent of 4 teaspoons of sugar. Whereas, for instance, microwavable veggie dish you can get at Trader Joe's, is actually good for you. We have peer-reviewed research that shows that even ultra-processed vegetables and fruit are actually beneficial to your health. Why? Because they're veggies and fruit. And similarly, something like an Impossible Burger or Beyond Burger might be a tiny bit high in sodium, but ultimately it's a really good way of eating protein, which is produced in a way that is far more sustainable and far more ethical than an equivalent animal-based burger. And so the reason we push back so hard against this category is we think that on balance, whatever the initial sort of intentions were of its creators, it's come to be misused in a way that we think misleads the public or leads the public to make assumptions that are ultimately false about the foods they're eating and also creates a lot of fear. It creates fear of novel foods where there should be no foods. Look, we know what's bad for you. It's bad to eat too much red meat. It's bad to eat too much sodium. It's bad to eat too much sugar. It's bad to eat too much fat. But it's about those things. It's not about the level of processing. And we really want to steer people towards a sort of more clear-eyed, more evidence-based view of what healthy eating constitutes. And sorry, I know this answer is going a little bit long, so I'll wrap it up by saying one thing. We're not saying you should just go ahead and eat all quote unquote all ultra processed foods, and that means eat what we historically call junk foods. We're not saying go to the grocery store, completely ignore the produce aisle, don't eat plant-based whole foods, and eat Doritos and Coke and give your money to the Pepsi Corporation or whatever, and you'll be fine. That's precisely not what we're saying. But what we are saying is if you want to eat a healthful diet, sure, get lots of stuff from the produce aisle because that's where you're going to get the most bang for your buck nutritionally. But also get the can of beans. If you don't want to soak your own beans, get the can of beans. Get the microwavable breakfast burrito, especially if it's like a tofu scramble burrito. Because if you don't have time to eat that, then you can just eat that. It's totally fine. It's what is processed, not how you process it, that matters. And we just think that this simple piece of knowledge, if it became the basis for how people talked about food, would sort of do away with a lot of fears and anxieties.
Yeah, I mean, not to add a ton here, but I think that we make 2 points in the book that I want to just sort of like jump off of Jan here on the question of processing. And the first one would be that we're not saying go eat as many Doritos as you want. At the same time, if you don't want people to eat Doritos, you probably shouldn't do this whole sort of like food movement nonsense where you accuse people who like Doritos of like food false consciousness. Like you actually have to reckon with the fact that a lot of processed foods that people may overindulge in and that may not be healthy actually serve up pleasure. And so our perspective on this is that we would be better served to make available high quality nutritional foods that are processed, that are made at scale to standard and are properly regulated to be safe, that you would do a lot more good in some senses than simply kind of like in a moralizing and highly dogmatic way, scolding people for liking things that they obviously do like, right? That they obviously do take some pleasure in. So our stance here is always like, don't say processing is bad. That's a gross oversimplification. Instead, what we want is people to think creatively about how we can improve the quality of processed food in supermarkets so that people are more likely to purchase them and to eat the high quality stuff that's nutritionally rich. And that to me is a fundamentally different sort of perspective than I think the food movement has taken in the past. And that's kind of like the second point to get Victoria to your to the second part of your question here about that political context. Um, we want to position ourselves against a kind of absolutism, a kind of Manichaeanism around food, puritanical sort of approach. We think that that leads to a lot of sermons, and it doesn't necessarily lead to a lot of changing behavior. Um, that's sort of like dogmatic, like there's only these one good foods and you got to eat all of them and they've got to be whole and they've got to be unprocessed and you got to cook them from scratch, right? Which is that's been the sort of the dogmatism of that movement. We think that sets up purity politics, and that purity politics are highly capturable particularly in the sort of like contemporary political context, they lead us to a lot of reactionary conclusions. I was listening to the interview that Michael Pollan did with the New York Times. It came out, I think, on Saturday, so just the day before the op-ed that we wrote in defense of industrial food came out. And Pollan was sort of like reminiscing on the politics of MAHA, the Make America Healthy Again movement, in light of his own writing in Omnivore's Dilemma and then Food Rules. And he had this kind of like bemused, like, whoa, isn't it weird that all of these reactionaries agree with a lot of like my stuff, or like rhetorically very similar. I wonder if there'll be a political alliance between Maha and the food movement people. And I think Jan and I look at that and we go, no, man. Like, no, Maha is your Frankenstein monster. Like, you spent a third of the Omnivore's Dilemma celebrating a libertarian right wing, like, small organic farmer Joel Salatin, who wrote a book called Everything I Want to Do is Illegal, which is a polemic against the regulatory state. And you celebrated that. And you said that the aesthetics of that is what like average consumers ought to be seeking out to save themselves. And all of a sudden now you're confused about why RFK Jr. and the Maha movement has people stirred up in ways that not only are they taking the wrong lessons about food from these people, who are total like ideologues in service, frankly, of the meat industry, but some other industries as well. But also now are turned off on vaccines. So now we have measles outbreaks, right? My sense about this is that there is zero reflection. There is zero critical reflection from the people who are pushing that sort of ascetic, absolutely moralistic, puritanical stuff, that instead of trying to figure out how to make it easier for average people to eat healthier, more nutritious, and delicious meals through the existing policy mechanisms, instead did the lazy thing of saying, oh, it's all garbage, it's all corrupt, it's all immoral, yada yada yada. Just go and farm it out of your backyard. They set themselves up to fail, but they also set up all of those people to fail, and they've never taken responsibility for it, and they really ought to.
Extremely well said. Thank you so much for clarifying some of that. I think that many of us as vegans, when we first saw the food movement, we thought we'd be part of it. It sounded kind of nice. And then we all went to see Food Inc. and we saw Joel Salatin cutting the heads off chickens as if that was good. And then that message of shop the edges of the supermarket. But for somebody who doesn't eat meat and dairy, we're kind of two of the edges are gone, and one edge is where you walk in, so you're left with one edge. That didn't make sense. And you're making so much come clear today. And your book, your amazing book, Feed the People, goes into far more detail and really will help us understand what's going on and what we can do about it. So for individuals listening, we want to be healthy, we want to be ethical, we want to be decent citizens. So what does that do to our shopping cart? Jan?
Yeah, I mean, look, as far as individuals can change their personal habits, in the book we give hints or sort of tips for both individuals and also for policy changes. Obviously, a lot of this has to do with policy change. But if you're an individual thinking about how to eat better, number one, you should absolutely eat as plant-based as you can. All research, all research we have shows that a plant-based diet is just across any metric of environmental impact, just far better for the planet than one that includes meat, and that includes meat from industrial systems and meat from non-industrial systems. The second thing you can do is do away with these sorts of anxieties, right? These sort of dietary anxieties peddled by diet gurus or by things like, the ultra processing definition, and just stick to foods that, broadly speaking, are relatively low in fat, relatively low in sugar, like all these basic tips we've had forever. But if that food is processed or comes in a can or comes in a package, that's totally fine. And then once you're doing that with the energy you've saved, you should probably push for shifting the food environments around you towards sort of plant forward environment, right? So if you work at an institution, push to have plant-based, plant-based dairy be the default for coffee. Push to have plant-based meals be the default meals for company meals or company catering. Just because we know that those sorts of nudges and those sorts of little shifts actually add up. And so as far as what individuals can do, that's probably the lowest hanging fruit. And then after that, it's about supporting, you know, calling your representatives, supporting lawmakers at different levels that are going to push for either policies that encourage that kind of eating, that discourage a food system predicated on environmentally unsustainable meat and dairy production, and also push for policies that are going to more broadly address the big picture food system issues. So, supporting lawmakers who support more funding for SNAP, who support universal school lunches, who support higher wages for food system labor. And that's really as simple as it gets, as far as I'm concerned.
Gabriel, anything to add there?
No, I think that was a great answer. I think that I mean, the only thing I would add to it is that a lot of our policy solutions are grounded in what we have been saying from the start is a necessity to engage the existing industrial food system. And so we kind of want to warn people against policy solutions that depend on like happy aesthetics, but that really don't scale. And it's not because, for example, like a local community garden isn't a lovely thing with real social value that we would like to see more of, frankly, that we think we would want to support and we would want communities to have available. But they're not food solutions. They don't generate a lot of food at a low enough cost at scale. And so as we think through all of these policy solutions and we think about how like people can become more involved in improving the food system, we want to like caution against them, maybe against the idea that it all gets to be, this kind of like romantic, like love. Like some of it is going to require doing things like improving cafeteria food for kids, right? Or working with schools on getting better school lunches. Some of it is about getting more money and more financing to organizations that like feed the hungry. And those things don't look like going out and having a great time on the farm or something like that. They look a lot more like putting yourself in industrial spaces and industrial workspaces and figuring out how can I contribute the most in these places to do the most good. And that's a very, very different approach. People may not find it as satisfying, but we think on the balance, it'll do a lot more good.
And how about this question of elitism? I mean, vegans have gotten that for years, even before there were any vegan processed foods to speak of, and we were all eating rice and beans and granola. So it is very expensive, certainly here in New York, to shop at farmers markets. It's a wonderful experience if you can afford it. Many people cannot. And overall, we've got everything going on from genuine food insecurity in America to lots of middle class people cutting back and juggling in ways that they weren't just a few years ago. What do we do about what food costs?
Yeah, look, the food cost question is a tricky one because some of it certainly is a question of corporate greed, right? So, for instance, grocery stores who mark up prices when input prices go up and then keep those prices high even when input prices go down. But by the same token, we have to be realistic about the fact that there are inflationary pressures across virtually all commodities, and that food cost is something that really has to be addressed at a deeper policy level, right? Like if food costs are up and people are spending more of their household budgets on food, then the best policies to address that are not food policies per se, but they're things like our rent control. They're things like building more affordable housing. They're things like better wages, right? So these broader economic policies that strengthen people's purchasing power, right? Like it's very easy to say, oh, like we'd like food costs to go down. Sure, but we also have to recognize that there are complex value chains behind those food prices. So there's no one lever anyone, and certainly no one politician can pull to make food prices lower, right? So yes, there are policies we could use to crack down on corporate malfeasance, on, for instance, on price fixing, but there's also a whole range of policies that should be focused on increasing household budgets or decreasing household expenditures on things like rent.
Yeah, and you know the distinction that we draw in the book that we think is really important for readers and the general public to know is that there's a difference between availability and access when we understand something like food scarcity. So when we look at a food system as a whole and we ask the question of is food available, the question is enough food produced to feed everyone who is eating from that food system? Access is a different question. It's whether or not all of the people who are eating from that food system can afford the food that's there, right? That's on the shelves. The United States doesn't have an availability problem for the most part. There are places where food is not available, usually mostly in rural places, and there are special sort of like policy solutions to that that we would endorse. But generally speaking, for most Americans, it's not an availability problem, right? It's not that there's not food on the shelves; it's that they don't have the resources to purchase the food that they want or that they need. And our sense about this, and I think Jan is getting at this, is that like the number one solution to people not having enough money to buy the food that they need is to give them money. And we have programs to do that. In some cases, it's also just to give them food. We also have programs to do that. The problem is that all of those programs are inadequately funded, right? So they're not funded at the levels that are necessary to actually wipe out the food access problems that we have. And finally, on that note, to sort of like hammer home Jan's point here, um, people who work in food services are much more likely to be food insecure. So they're much more likely to struggle with having the resources they need to get the food that they need. And that to us seems like a very perverse outcome, right? Because those are the people who are like feeding you, right? So the people who are feeding you are much more likely to not be able to feed themselves. Obviously, we talk about various government programs that redistribute income to people who are food insecure. But for workers, one of the easiest solutions is to argue for people to have better pay, right? And how we do that includes government policies like increasing the federal wage, federal minimum wage, but it also means helping workers organize and advocate for their own interests within their own workplaces. And so the book is very, very pro labor and it's pro organization as a result.
Sorry, if I can just hop on to the first part of your question though, the elitism. I think the elitism argument as leveled against vegans just isn't borne out by the actual cost of food. Eating at a farm to table restaurant or eating whatever pasture raised steak and vegetables from the farmer's market is orders of magnitude more expensive than going to the
Mhm.
supermarket, than going to the Key Foods in New York and getting some tofu and getting some beans and getting some tortillas and getting some apples, right? So even if on a unit to unit comparison, something like a Beyond Burger is slightly more expensive than a mass produced beef burger, and that's just a question of increasing production, so increasing scale to lower costs on the part of Beyond. But if you're comparing a vegan diet, which is a diet based, at least in part, presumably on an ethical commitment to helping animals, you can do that at a whole lot of different price points, and it's just made easier by alternative proteins and by alternative milks, which we support wholeheartedly. But if you're talking about real elitism, the real elitism is the elitism that tells people to eat steak at every meal. That's what's unaffordable, right? Never mind less sustainable and less ethical.
Mm. And I think many of our listeners who are very interested in health, who do their very best to eat a whole food, plant-based diet, It's interesting to me that in the Ornish program, for example, which was the first to show the health benefits, in fact, the revolutionary reversal of coronary disease when people believed that was not possible, that in their program, a whole section is devoted to packaged and processed foods that work within whole food plant-based guidelines simply to make people's lives easier. You know, it's one thing if you're a person of leisure who can cook all day long, and another thing if you've got work and family and other commitments. Now, I know that I could talk to you all day, but you have other things to do. I cannot let this interview end without bringing up a phrase that is used often through the book, and it's a really interesting juxtaposition of words. I'm going to use it in your testimonial from Bruce Friedrich from the Good Food Institute, great friend of our program, and among many very erudite people who did endorsements for Feed the People. Bruce Friedrich says of your book, with wit, clarity, and urgency, these authors argue for democratic hedonism as a compelling alternative to both industrial excess and locavore elitism. So tell us about democratic hedonism.
Yeah, so democratic hedonism is basically the sensibility that we want the world to be a yummier place and that we want pleasures, daily pleasures, small pleasures, personal pleasures, the pleasures that most of your listeners are going to recognize is that fill their mornings and their afternoons and bring a smile to their to their faces, that those things should be more readily available and they should be more equally distributed. We draw a distinction between mere hedonism, which we would say leads us on a path potentially to kind of narcissism and selfishness, which is an obsession with our own pleasures. And instead, we say that hedonism becomes defensible when it meets democracy, which is a broad sharing of power and social goods equitably and as accessibly within society as possible. We say when a sensibility that's organized to the moral value of pleasure meets democracy, we become invested in helping each other live better by having a yummier, tastier, and happier life, and hopefully by minimizing the harms that may go along with our pleasures. So this is not some sort of like the like the example of the Dorito. We're not out here to tell you that we think all pleasures ought to be pursued. There are pleasures that can be harmful, but we do want people to think about how to make the world as a whole a more pleasurable place, a more net pleasurable place, not just by pursuing their own pleasure, but by thinking about the pursuit of pleasure as a collective act, and frankly, as a political act. And so democratic hedonism is that idea, and it's a driving idea throughout the book that we think people will find pretty appealing, and I think more appealing than a kind of like shrill asceticism about food and about life in general. We hope that it's a more positive image and one that people will find attractive.
I'm attracted. Jan, last words?
No, I mean, I think Gabe summed it up perfectly.
Well, I think you've all summed it up really perfectly in this book, Feed the People. So I know I'm always telling you guys to buy books, but I mean, this is a game changer. Feed the People, Why Industrial Food is Good and How to Make It Even Better. So I will also invite you to check out mainstreetvegan.com where we have the show notes and there'll be more information about the book and its authors. And you can also find out more about Main Street Vegan Academy. We will be having our 39th cohort in the fall of 2026. You can take the course and become certified as a vegan lifestyle coach and educator. And this year we're doing something oh so special. We are having the New York City experience that is in early August. So you can get yourself to the Big Apple and have a wonderful weekend of learning and adventures and gosh, maybe some democratic hedonism. So do check us out at mainstreetvegan.com and by all means, look into Feed the People. It is stunning. Thank you, Jan. Thank you, Gabriel. It's just been such a pleasure to get to know you a little bit. So everybody, let's go out and make Main Street vegan.